Isia took a deep breath. No escape, slowly and hesitant, she removed her clothes already high in the mood. Ina reached for her, but as he undressed her, he felt something strange, confused. He turned on the main lights, and the moment he saw what lay between her thighs, he let out a loud, terrifying scream. His voice echoed through the entire hotel. There between Isa's thighs were two female private parts, one in the usual place and a smaller one slightly below it. It was an unnatural sight, something beyond human understanding. Ina stumbled backward, his face twisted in horror. What is this? He gasped. His legs wobbled. He stumbled back, knocking over a wooden chair. His heart was racing like a drum in a war song. Then a knock at the door. Arena, what is happening? More knocks. Then the door burst open. Ober's family, his friends, his servants, they all rushed in. And for the first time, its secret was no longer hers, alone. The bitter truth was revealed, and the long-kept secret was exposed to the whole world. Isima was so ashamed of herself, and the people around her started calling her a witch and a bad-luck human being. Someone made a remark. Who knows? Maybe she wanted to kill Obina. The words were too harsh for her to bear as she began to tremble. Another person said, "We don't want to hear anything from you, killer." "Who sent you?" Isima trembled in fear and shame as she began to speak. Obina, still trembling and gasping for breath, suddenly coughed. Blood trickled from his mouth, his eyes bulged in horror, and within moments, his body collapsed, convulsing violently. Before he breathed his last, the entire village stood in shock. The man who had just been celebrating his wedding hours ago was now dead. Emi lay on the cold floor, her hands shaking, her face wet with tears. The crowd roared above her, their voices sharp like knives. "She is a witch! She has deceived Obina! She killed him!" Em covered her ears. The voices were too loud, the words were too heavy. She wanted to scream, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare, but she couldn't. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she lifted her head. Her lips trembled, her voice was weak. "Please let me speak." "We don't want to hear anything from you, evil woman," someone shouted. "She must have used charms to trap Obina." Emi shut her eyes, took a deep breath, and then she spoke. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice cracking. The room fell silent. "I was born this way. I never knew. I swear I never knew." The villagers stared, their eyes filled with doubt and anger. But Izime continued. "I was just 5 years old when my mother died," she whispered. The crowd murmured, then the truth began to unfold. Many years ago, before Izime knew the meaning of pain, before she learned how to smile to hide her sorrow, she was just a little girl, a baby. Her father was a rich man with 6 wives. His house was full of children, but only one daughter, Isime. Her mother, Nika, was the youngest wife. She was beautiful and kind, but the other wives hated her. Not because she was the favorite, not because she was younger. They hated her because she gave birth to a girl. In the household, boys were everything. Boys carried the family name. Boys inherited the land. Boys were celebrated. But a girl was nothing. The stepmothers looked at her with jealousy and hatred. Why must she be the only one with a daughter? Em and Kai, the second wife, hissed. "We have given birth to sons, but look how happy our husband is because of this girl." Mama Joa, The third wife spat, but the worst of them all was the first wife, Mama Chidi. She was the oldest, the most powerful among the wives, and the most dangerous. Her heart was blacker than the darkest night. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Mama Chidi made a terrible decision. "This girl will never know happiness," she whispered. "I will make sure of it." She swallowed hard. One evening, my mother drank palm wine, but she never woke up. They said it was the gods, but I know the truth. She was poisoned. The people gasped. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. After she died, my stepmothers turned me into a slave. I woke up before the sun and slept long after the moon had risen. I fetched water, cooked, cleaned, and washed their clothes. And yet, I was never allowed to eat enough food. They made me sleep on the cold kitchen floor while the sons lay on soft mats. Her voice broke, but she kept going. I smiled, I laughed. I believed one day things would change. She paused, her chest rising and falling, but I did not know. She whispered that they had done something terrible to me when I was just a baby. The crowd held their breath. The elders leaned in closer. She wiped her tears. I never knew until tonight. Then the truth continued to surface. A long time ago, while I was still a little girl, deep in the heart of the forest, there lived a wicked. The herbalist's heart was dark, his eyes red like burning coal, and his voice was as dry as the Matan wind. People feared him. They said he could turn a man into a goat with just a whistle. One night, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, Mamadi crept into the forest carrying a black clay pot. Her wrapper was tied tight around her chest, her feet bare, her eyes full of wickedness. She walked deep into the forest, where the air smelled of rotten leaves and spirits whispered through the trees. When she reached the old herbalist's hut, she knocked 3 times. "Who dares disturb me at this hour?" a voice growled from inside. "It is me, Great One," Mamachi said, her voice shaking. "I need your help." The door creaked open, and the herbalist peered at her with his red, shining eyes. His teeth were yellow like old bones. "Speak," he said. Mamati stepped forward and whispered, "I want to ruin her life forever." The herbalist's lips curled into a wicked smile. He laughed, a sound like dry leaves crackling in fire. "A baby?" he asked, tilting his head. "You wish to curse a child?" Mamati nodded. "You are more wicked than I thought," the herbalist chuckled. Then he turned, picked up a wooden bowl and began to mix. He crushed dark leaves, poured thick black oil, and whispered strange words. The room grew colder, the air heavier. Then he dipped his fingers into the bowl and smeared a dark potion onto a small cloth. He turned to "Mummy, take this," he said. "Rub it on the baby every night. Slowly the curse will grow. She will carry shame for the rest of her life." Monsieur Chidi grinned. She took the cloth, tied it inside her wrapper, and hurried back home before the first rooster crowed. From that night, when everyone was asleep, she tiptoed into Isa's mother's room. The baby lay peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling. Mama unwrapped the cursed cloth and rubbed the dark potion on Isa's soft skin. Night after night she did the same, whispering, rubbing, cursing. The curse grew, and by the time Isime turned 5, it was complete. But nobody knew, not even Isime herself. Now, standing in the middle of the hotel room, her face soaked with tears, she whispered, "I didn't know, I swear I never knew." The villagers stared at her, their eyes wide with shock. The elders shook their heads. Her curse had been given to her before she even had a chance. Choice, but what could she do now? The whole village knew, and they were not ready to forgive. The sky was dark, but the village was awake. Torches burned bright, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was thick with anger, voices rising like thunder. "She is a witch, she has brought death to our people," someone shouted. "She is cursed, she must leave this village," another voice cried. The whole village gathered in the square, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. Children clung to their mothers, elders shook their heads, and the warriors stood ready, holding sticks and stones. In the middle of it all stood Izim. Her body shook, her eyes burned with unshed tears. Her feet felt heavy, like stones were tied to them. She turned to her father, her own father, the man she had called Papa since she was a child. He stood at the front, his arms folded, his face expressionless. His eyes did not meet hers, he did not say a word. "Papa, please," her voice cracked. But he did not move. He did nothing. Her heart shattered. The elders stepped forward, their faces grim. "This girl has brought misfortune to our village. 3 men have suffered because of her. One is blind, one is mute, one is dead. We cannot allow this evil to remain among us." The people cheered in agreement. One elder raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Izime is a disgrace. She must be banished." Izime fell to her knees. "Please, I didn't do anything. I didn't know," she sobbed, but no one listened. Another grabbed the other. They dragged her forward. Izime screamed, "Papa, help me!" But her father turned away. Her own blood had abandoned her. Tears blurred her vision. The crowd spat at her, threw sand at her. The first stone hit her back, then another, then another. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her. The village gates opened, and the moment she stepped past them, they slammed shut. She was no longer one of them. She was an outcast. The force she ran into was dark and cold. The trees whispered secrets to the wind, and the night creatures called to each other. Izime stumbled through the thick bushes, her feet bleeding, her arms covered in bruises. The pain in her heart was worse than the pain in her body. "Why? Why me?" she whispered to the wind. She walked for hours, not knowing where she was going. She was tired, hungry, and cold. At last her legs gave out, and she collapsed by the root of an old tree. Her stomach growled, her lips were dry. She had nothing. No food, no water, no home. Tears slid down her face as she curled up on the cold ground. She had lost everything. Her home, her family, her name. Her world had ended, but she did not know that fate was not done with her yet. Izime walked and walked. Days passed. Her feet were swollen, her lips were cracked, and her stomach cried for food. The forest was endless. Tall trees blocked the sun. Shadows danced on the ground, and strange sounds came from deep in the bushes. Whispers, rustling leaves, the call of unseen creatures. She drank from small streams and ate wild fruits, but they were bitter, and some made her stomach turn. She had never been this alone. At night, the cold wrapped around her like a wicked spirit. She shivered, hugging herself, whispering, "Why me? What have I done?" But the forest did not answer. One evening, just as the sky turned red like fire, Isim saw it. A small mud hut hidden between two giant trees. Smoke curled from the thatched roof, a sign of life. With her last strength, she dragged herself to the door and knocked. There was a long silence, then the door creaked open. An old woman stood there. Her eyes were sharp, her face wrinkled like old leather, and her silver hair hung in long, thin braids. She held a wooden staff, and around her neck were cowrie shells that jingled softly. She looked at Izime once, just one look, and her eyes widened. "My child," her voice was deep and slow. "You carry a curse." Izime's heart stopped. "Please help me, Mama. I have nowhere else to go." The woman stepped aside. "Come inside.